In Surt's fight with the gods, in keeping with his volcano association, he burns everything on land. So you might say that the gods were Surted out, or perhaps fired. If there is a deity in Norse myth that is seen as like the Norse Satan, Surt, or Surtur, is probably the one who best fits the description. He's the ruler of a fiery world. He's often depicted with horns and a flaming sword. He fights the gods. He wins. He's a world ender, as Fenrir destroys the sun and Jormungandr poisons the air. Surt's fire washes across the land. But who is this entity? How does he fit into the rest of Norse myth? Do people worship Surt today? Should people worship him? Is that bad? What about historically? What would it mean to worship Surt? Let's dive into all of this and more. Surt is no doubt one of the more controversial entities in the Norse pantheon, but before we get into the controversy of Surt, which is messy, by the way, let's break down some of the basics regarding him. Now, to start, there's very little information out there on Surt, and what is out there leaves a lot to be explored. He's only sparingly mentioned across the myths, and there's only one major story, and that story is Ragnarok, where he destroys everything in a world-ending flame. So there's not a lot to go on, but let's get into it. Surt may be, according to myth, one of, if not the oldest of the mythological figures in Norse myth, at least those still active in myth. Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda gives details of the Norse creation myth, and I'll give you the quick and dirty version of it. Snorri describes the icy world of Niflheim, and the fiery world of Muspel, and the Gnunga Gap, which is the yawning void between them. Rivers would flow out of Niflheim, and then sparks from Muspel would drift across the Gnunga Gap, and then the interaction between these two worlds would contribute to the origins of the ice giant Ymir and the life-giving cow Audhumla. And from this story precipitates the conflict between Ymir and the sons of Bor, who are Odin, Vili, and Ve, and that would eventually result in the creation of Midgard, which is our world, the universe we experience, or whatever. Prior to this whole story, however, it is mentioned that in the land of fire, Muspel is its guardian, Surt. There's no origin out of flames or anything like that. Nothing like that is described. He's just there. And by the time Ymir's origins are described, Snorri's narrative has already established Surt in Muspel with his flaming sword doing his thing. So for me, this results in a pile of questions to which I don't have any answers whatsoever. Was he eternal? Did he have his origins in Muspel, or is he the creator of Muspel? Is he the creator of this whole ice and fire thing? Who knows? Not me. Maybe Snorri knows, but he's not telling due to slight case of death. Perhaps we can get some answers to these questions if we investigate the word Muspel, and this search unfortunately does not reveal anything concrete, as it is a puzzle that has not yet been cracked. So, spoilers, no answers, just more questions. A number of meanings have been suggested, the main one being basically fiery destroyer of the world. This context is informed by a 9th century poem called Muspili, which uses the term in reference to the apocalypse. Unfortunately, the subject of the poem is Christian and describes the apocalyptic battle between angels and devils before the final judgment. So it's a Christian text. It just uses a very interesting word in a very interesting way. Our good buddy Snorri, however, in the Prose Edda, references Muspel as a place, not an event. In the Poetic Edda, the Voluspa could be a little bit more ambiguous, and it may reference Muspel as a personified entity. So we ultimately have 3 possible usages: an event, a place, and a personified entity. And this opens up a few possibilities around the word, because it could be any of these 3 things or some combination thereof. Muspel might have been the name of a mythological being, perhaps another name for Surt. Perhaps it's the father of Surt. Perhaps Muspel is the unseen ruler and Surt is his champion. Perhaps the place itself is personified in some way. We don't know. Surt leads the sons of Muspel in Snorri's description of Ragnarok, and this could refer to Muspel as a mythological figure or just a metaphorical reference to fire giants originating from the land of fire. Again, we just don't know. The word, by the time of the Viking Age, appears to reference the place of fire in which Surt resides rather than an entity or an event, but maybe it was a different one of these things. Maybe it was all 3. I love history. Speaking of language, you might notice that I am just saying Surt rather than Surtur. The R placed at the end of some names is an Icelandic way of denoting masculinity. In English, it is often but not always dropped. As an English speaker myself, I admit to just kind of using it preferentially. I might drop it for Heimdall versus Heimdallr, but I will use it for Freyr and Njorthr. Some people will say Frey and Njorth. Both are correct, neither are wrong, but it is something that you may want to consider, say, if you lean particularly Icelandic in your practice or something like that. With Surt, honestly, I kind of go back and forth myself, but Surt is easier to say, and this video is on the longer side for me, so there you have it. Anyway, back to the fire guy. So how about Surt's name? Does that mean anything? Straightforwardly, it just means black. Scholar of Old Norse folklore John Lindow has suggested that this might mean that Surt has a charred appearance. And this could inspire some poetic names, also known as kennings, such as the Black God, Dark One, Charred God. These are not really historical kennings for Surt, but they are extrapolations based on Lindau's interpretation. This gets us to the complicated history of Ragnarok. This myth is central to the modern cultural understanding of Norse myth, and it requires a little deconstruction because, in my opinion, it is broadly misunderstood. Snorri cites as his evidence the Voluspa from the Poetic Edda, which itself is an interesting source. The Ragnarok narrative that we have available to us is likely not the same as whatever it was that Viking Age heathens believed. The Voluspa, and Snorri's description of it, seems to be a smashing together of several myths that describe thematic rivalries between different deities. For example, Thor and Jormungandr, Loki and Heimdall, and in this case, Freyr and Surt. So these rivalries are strung together in a story that has several little moments that seem to have Christian influence. Scholar Eyrbyggja Turville-Petre suspected that the poet who originated the Voluspa may have been a pagan, but was also an eclectic and incorporated Christian themes and imagery into the Voluspa. Now, it's difficult to know the intention of the poet, but there's moments in the poem that reveal themes of Christian thought, such as the brother turning against brother thing, or stars falling from the sky after the darkening of the sun, this kind of stuff. This influence may or may not have been intentional, but as a result, taking the Ragnarok story at face value for Viking Age beliefs is unwise. There's also another version of the Voluspa that involves what appears to be the Christian god showing up at the end, and that too, I would say, has some Christian influence. All that being said, what do we make of this whole, Surt-Freyr rivalry? There's a couple of things to go through first. I've seen some descriptions of this battle that suggests that Surt and Freyr kill each other. And while this is true of Loki and Heimdall and of Thor and Jormungandr, it does not appear to be true for Freyr and Surt. I could not find any description that even suggests that Surt dies in this exchange, by Freyr's hand or otherwise. Credit to Freyr's death is given to his lack of sword, which he had given away in the process of obtaining a bride. He is sometimes depicted instead as holding an antler, due to a story where he kills a Jotun with an antler. Whatever the case, the fight does not go well for Freyr, who dies against Surt's flaming sword. Afterward, the world is covered in Surtologi, or Surt's fire. I'm sure there's a pun to be made somewhere about the fertility god and his big old antler being horned. Surt is only mentioned in Icelandic sources, but that doesn't mean that belief in Surt was limited to Iceland. However, his mythological importance may have been more extreme in Iceland given the presence and danger of volcanic activity. Volcanoes are dangerous, but at the same time, they are also an important part of the environment. And in the case of Iceland, volcanoes are the reason why it's even there. The very land that the Icelanders walked on had been created by volcanoes, and yet a particularly violent eruption could conceivably destroy them. It's hard to say to what extent they believed one or both of these statements. We do know, however, that they saw quite a few eruptions. Now, mainland Norway, Sweden, and Denmark do not have active volcanoes. Iceland has a wealth of volcanoes, over 100, with several active ones, and that's a fairly extreme difference. Imagine, because they were migrating from this area with no volcanoes to this area with a literal fuck ton of volcanoes. So imagine having no clue what a volcano even is, and then seeing the eruption of an active volcano for the first time. Their beauty, their horror, their destructive power, no doubt made an impression on the early Icelanders.
This is Iceland 1973. The small southern island of Heimaey was surprised by a trench opening and spewing red-hot lava. Maurice captures here an apocalypse that we have never seen before on film.
Yes, hello, I am an Icelandic Viking and I am freaking the fuck out. In fact, shortly after the settlement, there was a rather large volcanic eruption called, and I'm going to try and pronounce this, the Hallmundarún lava flow. I'll put that name down below because pronouncing it is hard. This eruption lasted quite some time, decades perhaps, and it formed quite a series of lava caves. Unfortunately, the ensuing lava flow covered several square kilometers, which may have included a handful of farmsteads. Now, imagine again, you're an early Icelander, and you've never heard of a volcano, and now lava is slowly coming toward your home. Somebody in history probably experienced exactly that. That was someone's really rough day. The lava flow wound up forming caves, and one of the caves formed in this eruption is called Surtshellir. And this name means Surt's cave, or black cave. And this cave is mentioned a couple of times in records and sagas as being a base for outlaws at various points in time post-conversion. Snorri's son was tortured there, for example. It also had a reputation for being haunted. There is, however, one strange story about a man named Thorvald Hollowthroat, who traveled to the cave to recite a poem he had written about the Jotun who lived there. That's curious. Exploring the cave, there is a series of structures inside. There's a wall, there's piles of bones, and there is this stone boat-like structure that has burned remains in it of various items. Now, early interpretation of this site held that this was an outlaw encampment. But later interpretation, and I'm in agreement with this, holds that the archaeological evidence more strongly supports a ritual site. And that ritual site was likely specifically for Surt. The defense for outlaws is easy. The cave is mentioned as an outlaw hideout a few times in the sagas. It's got a wall in it. You know, it's a cave which provides shelter from the elements. Ideal situation for an outlaw, really. No doubt outlaws found their home there at various points in time. Something that threw me off, however, is while I was reading the papers talking about the outlaw encampment and how many bones there were in various places and so on, there was a mention that they were all bones of domestic animals, and that set my alarms off a little bit. I love the Outlaw sagas. The famous outlaws Grettir and Gisli are two of my favorite characters in the sagas, and their lives are fraught with turmoil throughout their time as an outlaw. A major through line in the Icelandic stories about outlaws is that they cannot stay in one place for very long. Grettir the Strong, for example, who lived as an outlaw for nearly 20 years, rarely stayed in one location for more than a couple of years, and even that was long. And this is for two major reasons. One, in the case of an encampment, pressure would rise on the local chieftain to deal with the problem, and they would eventually raise a small army and just take care of the issue. So the idea of an outlaw encampment existing for a few months, that's reasonable. But evidence points to this site being consistently maintained for 80 to 120 years, starting just after the cave's formation. That's not an outlaw encampment. The second issue for me is that the bones discovered there are from domesticated animals exclusively. Now, that would be weird for outlaws. It's not weird for sacrifices at all, but it would be very weird for outlaws. Exclusively domesticated animals means that this food is coming from the local farms in some way. What would be more likely to fit outlaws is some mixture of domesticated animals and hunted animals. And let me explain why. In the Icelandic outlawry system, any aid given to an outlaw would be seen as aiding and abetting, basically, which would be punishable in Icelandic law. And the conclusion here would have to be that local farms were gifting their animals to this outlaw encampment in return for something, perhaps. This would have the potential to incriminate everyone involved. An arrangement like this might make sense in the short term, but not the long term. Outlaws, especially like a band of them, could be raiders, so maybe they were pressuring or raiding local farms, and they could be sustaining themselves for a period of time that way. But the longer that goes on, it raises the likelihood of a farmstead taking their case to the local chieftain, and then possibly even going to the Althing. And at that point, You got the whole island riled up. This would not have lasted long. Personal property rights of landowners were sacred to the Icelanders. So a band of outlaws threatening that through some kind of unlawful tribute system, that would have been an absolute outrage. So was there an outlaw hideout there? I mean, there's stories of them, but like in those stories, it seems like they were dealt with fairly quickly. So they don't account for that period of time in which there was a consistent maintenance of the space. After that period of time, it's more likely, but not during that period of time. But let me know in the comments if you want me to make a more detailed video on outlawry in Iceland. There's a whole lot to explore there and a ton of cool stories. The far more likely thing is that this space was a ritual site. Now, when I set out to cover this topic, I'd heard some whispers that this was a ritual site, so I was expecting the evidence to be fairly sparse, especially considering the controversy around Surt and modern heathenry. So I was expecting to find, like, consistent with maybe a few rituals being held there off and on. That's not what I found. What seems to be there is infrastructure consistent with regular offerings in the space. Found within this this boat-like structure are, various bones, glass beads, fire starters, stuff that I recalled also being found in the ritual site to Ullr in Sweden. But also, very weirdly, a few little bits of orpiment ore. Now, this would have been wildly expensive as it would have been sourced from modern-day Turkey at this time. And this is the only find of it in Iceland. That's crazy to have been found in the middle of a fire pit. Now, this leads me to believe that not only was this a ritual space for offerings, but it was a highly important one, and it was sometimes attended to or cared for by elites among the Icelanders. The continuous maintenance over the course of around a century suggests that this was a space of generational importance, considering how long humans live, and especially how long humans live in early medieval Iceland. There wasn't a single person just keeping this space for that long. The main caretaker or caretakers trained their replacements, and this transition likely happened several times. This may have been a position that was held by somebody in the midst of a political rise to show their devotion to the gods and also their community, thereby aiding in their future career. Perhaps this was a position that was held for life, but it was attained after years of preparation. Perhaps this was a shift that was sort of tossed back and forth by several local Gothies, each particularly devoted to the ritual nature of the space, whatever that was. Unfortunately, we cannot know the nature of the people who cared for this space. We can only see what is in the dirt and conclude from there. Lastly, the nature of the fire itself is important. This, I keep calling it a boat-like structure, but there's no other name for it. It's just a stone boat looking. Anyway, it would host incredibly hot fires, getting to about 600 to 900 degrees Celsius, and that's about 1100 to 1600 degrees in freedom units. This is important because of what else is found in the space. In the middle of the fire pit are a series of lead weights, and one of them is in the shape of a cross. That's interesting. In my opinion, this is the result of the final ritual that took place in this space. Lead melts at 327 degrees Celsius, or 621 degrees in freedom units, and this fire pit could create fires obviously far more intense than that, which leads me to believe that the fires stopped after this little cross was placed here. The continuous maintenance of the space stopped around 20 years after the conversion of Iceland, which is probably when this cross showed up. So let me unpack why that makes sense. Firstly, let's talk about the conversion itself. There's a couple of stories of the conversion of Iceland, but they're consistent on a few things. The King of Norway demanded the conversion of Iceland and was willing to back up his demands with a blockade. Iceland had two choices: convert or starve. And after much deliberation, the leadership of Iceland opted to nominally convert, but allow the practice and worship of heathen gods privately. This was sufficient for Norway, and the conversion process began. Now, it wasn't long until the protections for heathen practices were also revoked. Big surprise. Whatever the ritual nature of the Surtshellir practices, it seems that they were left alone for a while until the process of conversion had moved further along. Now, this makes sense, as the ritual space is fairly remote, and if it was ever a public event, it may have just become a smaller private one. It also may have been something that the local population considered to be very important. Perhaps they believed that if the ritual stopped, the volcano would unleash its destructive power yet again. After this, the evidence of activity in the cave becomes more sporadic. At this point, it makes sense that outlaws would have set themselves up in the cave from time to time, perhaps utilizing the existing wall to their advantage. Again, this only would have worked as a temporary solution, but for outlaws, a temporary solution is an acceptable solution. There's no such thing as a permanent solution. Post-conversion, the stories around the cave become, let's say, disreputable. There's outlaws, there's torture, there's hauntings. Satan himself is supposed to rise out of the cave at Judgment Day, which is probably a demonization of Surt, turning him into Satan. It's a whole thing. In fact, in my opinion, the lead weights that are found in the fire pit, including the one in the shape of a cross, it seems likely to be a ritual response to the site's history with Surt. Now, the Christian priests of Iceland were no doubt familiar, at least to some extent, with the heathen myths of the area. Seeing offerings and rituals to Surt as demon worship, even Satan worship, was probably completely reasonable to the mind of an early medieval Christian priest, and this probably demanded a ritual response of their own. This little lead cross could have had a number of functions. Perhaps it was to seal Surt inside of the cave. Perhaps it was to bless the location and offer a Christian replacement for keeping the volcano at bay. Again, the true nature of the ritual purpose of this cross is a mystery, and we are missing significant context around the rituals that it might be a response to in order to really extrapolate all of that. All we have is what's in the dirt. Whatever the case, the cave was avoided for about 6 centuries after the Viking Age, until some explorers left a few coins in the cave as testaments to their visits. As far as historical practice as it relates to Surt, like what did Surt veneration, if that's what it was, look like? We can't really say for sure. Even considering it veneration may be an overstep. Archaeologically, the nature of the rituals themselves remains a mystery. Was the purpose of the ritual to honor Surt? To placate him? Some combination? We don't really know. Was the motivator fear? Was it respect? Again, we don't really know. Was the Ragnarok story of Surt's Logi or Surt's fire covering the land reflective of a volcanic fear of the Icelanders? Probably, at least a Christianized one. Does it reflect the Viking Age belief of a horrifying Surt? Perhaps. The pieces might fit, but again, we don't really know. Humans are often quite scared of the unknown. Think about horror movies that you've seen for a minute. One element that can make a horror movie work is that you understand just enough to comprehend the danger, but not the nature of what makes the danger. The unpredictability makes it scary. And once you can anticipate the next moves of that which is dangerous, the fear is suddenly reduced. A horror movie that is predictable is less scary than one that has built tension around uncertainty. And once that tension breaks, it can be less scary. And the early Icelanders were probably scared shitless by some of the volcanoes that surrounded them, especially the one that slowly flowed lava near their farmsteads for decades. They didn't understand what made them work. They couldn't detect an eruption about to take place. They did not know when an eruption was going to stop. They didn't know how long a lava flow was going to last. So there was uncertainty, there was tension, there was fear. When this volcano became active shortly after the Vikings settled Iceland, no doubt there were rituals pleading with the gods to stop the flow of lava. And one day, it stopped. And then, if place names are to inform, they set up rituals to Surt. Now, why did they do that? Did they credit Surt with the tension? Or the breaking of the tension? Or both? And how much did this fear of the unknown affect the narratives as it relates to Surt? We don't really know the answers to these questions. This could have just as easily been a way to thank him as it was to placate him. The question regarding Surt is, how extreme was the demonization of Surt after Christianization? Did Surt become a Satan-like figure in the Eddas because of his fearsome place in heathen belief? Or was he warped to fit a Christian narrative because of his association with, like, volcanoes in a fiery realm? Either could be true, both could be true. Perhaps he was fearsome but respected, and this was warped into an enemy of the gods. Perhaps he was a fiery rival with Freyr, threatening fertile lands with lava flow. Perhaps we are missing a harrowing myth where Freyr, bearing his antler, pushed Surt back one day. Maybe the rituals at Surtshellir were conducted by priests of Freyr, reenacting the god of peace setting down the boundary between humanity and Surt's fire. Maybe the interrelationship between Surt and Freyr is more nuanced than a simple rivalry. I think this is reasonable to assume, actually, because things like this are rarely so simple, in my opinion. Maybe the Icelanders noticed that the land affected by the lava flow became rich and fertile due to the nutrients in the soil. Rain from Freyr breaks down the volcanic rock and ash from Surt, creating better farmland. Perhaps the offerings to Surt started out as placation, but then turned into reciprocity over time, only to have him demonized by Christians in the years to follow. Like many rivalries in Norse myth, perhaps the relationship is more symbiotic than adversarial. One of them represents a more natural force, and the other is defending humanity's place in it all. Perhaps these rituals were to thank Surt for his part in everything. Surt's lava is, of course, dangerous, but this does not make him evil. Thor's lightning is also dangerous, and yet he is not evil. One thing that kind of bugs my brain a little bit when I'm thinking about the structure of this ritual space, the area containing the fire could get so incredibly hot, and that suggests a huge fire that was probably a representation of Surt in some way. It's easy to imagine this as a celebration of Surt. Like, sure, maybe it's meant to be a representation of how big and scary he is, placing the Gothi before it as a representation of Freyr standing against the destructive flames, but the offerings are found inside the fire pit, meaning that the gifts, the offerings, were thrown into this raging fire, given to Surt. The image of that in my mind just rings as a celebratory act. And even if the rituals to Surt in history were in fear of him, that doesn't mean the same has to be true today. The modern conversations in heathenry around modern rituals to Surt are, well, they're not nearly this nuanced. He's often brought up as an obvious example of a god you shouldn't worship, using what I think are pretty simplistic objections. Surt bad in the Ragnarok myth, therefore worshipping Surt will cause a volcano to be formed underneath your house or something. To be a little more serious, some heathens will say that to worship Surt means that you desire to bring about the end of the world, be that in the form of Ragnarok or a supervolcano or something along those lines. And this would be regardless of whether or not this is your intention. This is silly to me, but it is pervasive. The worship of Surt has been banned in many heathen groups and organizations, and if there isn't an explicit ban, there's sometimes one in the form of social expectations. Saying that you worship Surt might get you a side-eye in certain... anyway, in certain heathen social circles. Some have walked back on it, but not clearly. Let's talk about the Troth. The Troth advertises itself as the largest heathen inclusive organization. I don't know how true that is these days, but it is how they market themselves. The reason why I bring them up is that over the course of modern heathen history, they have been kind of a bellwether of where heathen conversation is at. The Troth walked back on their Surt worship ban at their events as recently as 2023, but their statement on it rings to me as unclear. They took the ban out, to be sure, but in their statement, Surt, along with Fenrir, is brought up as one of the examples of what might be a ridiculous or even condemnable act of veneration without a substantive response. So they seem to be still unpacking this. Their reasoning is that they don't do orthodoxy, and the defense, it really stops there. This is, in fact, a little frustrating, and I'll talk a little bit about why. They had a Loki ban for a little while too, and by a little while I mean a decade. When the Loki ban was lifted in 2019, the Troth committed to a ritual in honor of Loki at their central event every year for each year that he was banned as an apology, totaling 10 years and 10 rituals. This is a great idea. However, no such ritual apology was offered to Fenrir, Jormungandr, Surt, or any others that were affected by this ban once their own bans were lifted in 2023. They were banned for longer, and modern heathen culture has similarly maligned these deities. All of this communicates to me that despite their position on no orthodoxy, their leadership broadly views Loki as worthy of an apology, and these other deities as not worthy of an apology. All of this, of course, means that there needs to be some unpacking of the history and thought process here, because not only is there historical demonization of Surt by Christians, but there is modern demonization by heathens, and that bears some covering. So what did the Troth say before all that? Well, in their publication, Our Troth, which was written or published prior to the lifting of their ban, but after the lifting of the Loki ban, that's confusing. There's two bans. So it was in 2020. Loki ban was lifted in 2019. The Surt and others ban was lifted in 2023. So it's published in between the two. Why are we banning deities? I don't know. I'm glad that Troth is finally caught up on that. But anyway, within the text, they acknowledge that heathens worship Surt, and they state that he's not allowed to be hailed at Troth events, and they caution against the worship of a god with such destructive potential. But as I stated before, destructive potential doesn't seem to be an issue with other deities. It doesn't make them evil, such as in the case of Aegir, Thor, Hel, Ran. It's hard to argue against their destructive potential. Arguably, any deity would have destructive potential. Freyr, for example, is typically associated with rain, and rain alone has brought about destruction. So from that, Freyr would have immense destructive potential. I just don't see that potential as a reason not to give offering to a deity. This rings to me as an unjustified fear of the gods, which is literally what the ancient Greek philosopher Theophrastus described as superstition around 300 BC. So, I don't know, this argument doesn't resonate with me at all. Maybe it's part of why this was eventually rolled back, but such a correction was not included in their lifting of the ban. They don't address the arguments they made before against these deities. And for over a decade, these arguments worked and are broadly a relative standard in heathenry. But that's the third edition of our Troth. When you go back before that to the first or second edition, the rhetoric gets a little more extreme. Surt and the Muspelli are described as unequivocally destructive, the absolute foes of all that lives and is, and further it describes that they only show up at the end of the world, and that there's not even a hint of evidence that they were ever worshipped in history. Now, granted, at the time that this was written, the discussion around this location as a ritual site for Surt had not yet begun, but that brings me to my larger point. There's a lot of heathens who wind up putting forward this argument against some deities, that if there is no historical evidence of worship concerning a particular deity, then that deity ought not be worshipped. The availability of historical descriptions or archaeological evidence then becomes the doxastic standard concerning practice. This argument gets brought up against Loki, for example. No evidence of a Loki cultist, therefore you should not worship Loki. And the same goes for Jormungandr, Fenrir, Hel, and a lot of other controversial deities. The problem is, this standard gets selectively applied. Basically, the roster is already decided based on pre-existing interpretation, regardless of whether or not evidence is available. There are many gods that are broadly worshipped today, which have controversial or are even completely lacking in historical evidence of cultus, cultus being practice of worship. Sif, for example, has zero evidence of historical cultus, and yet no one really complains about the modern worship of her, nor should they. The same is true for Frigg. There are plenty of stories about her, but when it comes to evidence of worship, it's lacking. There's plenty for Freya, but not for Frigg. And this isn't to say that they were not worshipped in history. It's likely that they were. It's just the evidence didn't survive to greet us. To say that heathens should not worship a deity because there is no historical evidence for that worship is stupid for two reasons. First, you never know what's going to be found. Case in point with Surt. And second, the lack of historical evidence for worship isn't very meaningful, especially in heathenry. We have no substantive written records authored by heathens of the Viking Age, besides the occasional rune carving, many of which do not discuss religion at all. Christians from the subsequent period had motivation to destroy such evidence, and many items of worship were made from perishable materials, such as wood. And this is true for, your big grand temple items of worship, but it's especially true for personal items, which may have been made by whittling a log or a branch. So, the vast majority of objects used for venerating the gods from heathen times are just gone. A handful of those objects have reached us today, and that's amazing, but we should not take those objects as an exhaustive representation of their spirituality. We should assume instead that it is a tiny, tiny sample. Another issue with that statement is that, especially with Surt, sometimes you're just wrong. Even without the ritual site, it may look like that you're haven't taken everything into account, or you're maybe even ignoring something, or purposefully ignoring something. Our Troth makes the claim in 2006 that there's not even the slightest hint of evidence that Surt was ever worshipped. Now, remember that story that I mentioned earlier about a guy offering poetry to Surt? That story is in the Book of Settlements, which was available in 2006. This text briefly describes an account of Thorvald Hollowthroat going to Surt's cave and reading poetry to the Jotun who lived there, presumably Surt. I'd say that surpasses slightest hint, and it's certainly more than we have for a lot of Norse deities. In fact, that little sentence provides a little bit of context to the ritual space we were talking about earlier. Let's say that you want to make the argument that it isn't Surt who is worshipped there, but it's Freyr instead. Well, You would need to contend with the fact that the only piece of literature evidence that we have discussing this location involves an offering directly to Surt, with no mention of Freyr whatsoever. That, along with the place name, is pretty convincing to me. Poetry offered to Surt in Surt's cave, where there is an offering space. That's pretty overwhelming evidence in the context of heathenry. We don't get that kind of evidence very often. So if you're going to be asserting that it's not Surt who was worshipped there, and instead it was Freyr, you're going to be doing so in spite of evidence to the contrary, and that would need to be explained. Now, a discussion of history is a little different from a discussion of spirituality. Maybe you look at the evidence, and you, within the greater context of things, conclude for yourself that this is a ritual site that mainly celebrated Freyr and placated Surt. I think there's a few ways you could do that, some of which I've even discussed in this video, and that's fine, even reasonable. But that doesn't change the fact that there is evidence for this space as a ritual space for Surt. So to take that interpretation and then say to a modern practitioner that they should not worship Surt because there is no evidence is unjustified for several reasons, but chiefly because it is built upon a false statement. That's true now, and it was true in 2006 and in 1993 when the first edition was published. To explore this a little further, the nature of this poem offered by Thorvald Hollowthroat is unknown. There is a saga called the Saga of the Cave Dwellers, quoting Hollowthroat's poem as one that is very much in praise of Surt. It describes him as a shapeshifter, a blesser of good harvests and frith, and the enemy of plagued herds. This gives us a ton of interesting references that anyone exploring praxis with Surt could certainly use. Individual interests on this evidence, however, will vary depending on what you're looking for. The problem with this evidence and this description is that it seems to originate from the 19th century and can hardly be seen as reliable, but it is certainly neat. And at the very least, it would show that the impression that Thorvald Hollowthroat's poem to Surt was in praise of the ancient Jotun culturally predates modern heathenry, which only started rising in popularity during and after the 1960s and 70s. The true nature of the worship of Surt could have taken many forms. As discussed, the rituals at Surtshellir could have been the placation of what was seen as a violent volcano deity which had recently unleashed his wrath and left a mighty scar on the land in the form of a black cave. But perhaps this was not placation. Perhaps Surt's destructive power was simply seen as one of his many attributes, as are the destructive attributes of many other Norse deities. Maybe the volcano's relationship with fertility was noticed, and this, combined with the violent nature of volcanoes, put him in a complicated rivalry with Freyr. And this rivalry eventually became the Christianized narrative that we see in the Voluspa. So this comes up a lot in my videos, that there are multiple ways of looking at history, and this leads us to a second level to this perspective on historical worship. Many heathens are Reconstructionists, and Reconstructionism is usually framed as a recreation of a spirituality of the past. Now, there's a few problems with just doing this straightforwardly and without exception, and I've gone into them in a few other videos that I'll link in the description. But as this relates to Surt, a lot of heathen Reconstructionists would say that because those in history saw him in a certain way, we should also today view him in the same way. And they'll often make this point with Jormungandr, Fenrir, and others. But this unnecessarily shackles us to a snapshot in history, a snapshot that, quite frankly, is extremely foggy. And in light of that, we have to make assumptions in order to fill in various gaps. And those assumptions may or may not represent what history actually looked like. Let's assume that we could know. We can't, but let's assume that it is the fact of the matter historically that offerings to Surt were done in the spirit of placation, and that he was seen in this way. What does that mean for the modern worship of Surt? Well, we know more about volcanoes now than we used to, and our greater understanding of volcanoes can probably give us greater insight into Surt. Volcanoes are immense, they are powerful, they are destructive, but they are also essential and really as creative as they are destructive. They build islands, they offer up minerals from the depths of the earth, they create fertile land. The deity associated with volcanoes should probably be viewed in this light. Is there a strong wrath to volcanoes? Yeah, but that's not their only attribute, and to focus on that attribute and boil them down to that wrath would be an oversimplification, just as it would be an oversimplification of Surt. The context of volcanoes can give us context to Surt. Our learning about the world around us can translate into learning about the gods. Just because there was a historical view on a deity does not mean that we need to have the same view of that deity today. Society changes, our understanding of nature changes, and as these things change, so does religion. It may have been the case that our relationship with some of the gods in history were based on fear, but as we have grown to understand that which they are associated with, that fear of the unknown can disappear, and we can step out of the horror film, and we can see the gods in a new light. Religion has never been a static force. Sometimes it has tried to be, but with limited success. It is constantly transforming. We change as we learn. So if we should not change, it follows that we should not learn. For heathens, history is a remarkable resource, but it should not be viewed as a source of orthodoxy. In fact, to do so would violate the very premise of looking to history in the case of heathenry. Heathenry has changed through the ages. Heathenry through the lens of the Icelanders in the 900s is very different from heathenry through the lens of the Swabians in the 1st century. History should be a source of inspiration. Take from history, build on it, seek further understanding. Do honor to our spiritual ancestors with what we have learned since their time. And for many, this will include a space for Surt on their altar. Surt is, interestingly, one of the few deities where we actually do have some record of what was offered to him. And as with all the gods, I think that any of the standard offerings to any of the gods would work just as well for Surt as they would for any other deity. Things like incense, food, water, any libation offering, and so on. But in the case of Surt, we can certainly reference the contents of that fire pit. And obviously there is that specific story of Thorvald Hollowthroat offering him poetry. And this inspires a few interesting thoughts. One, that Surt likes poetry, and that's certainly neat. Two, that perhaps Surt may be offered to if you are writing poetry or something that requires a poetic flair. Perhaps he can be seen as a dark muse of sorts. And lastly, the story itself actually confirms that poetry was a legitimate offering to the gods. I've seen some occasional discourse among pagans as to whether or not offering creative works is legitimate, and this historical record shows that in the case of history, yeah, it is. Surt winds up being one of the more complicated deities that I've covered here, if only because the modern views of him are so complicated. In my opinion, Surt is often maligned and oversimplified, but this isn't necessarily new. Many of our gods are oversimplified to one attribute. For example, Thor to strength, Odin to wisdom, Freyr to fertility, and then Surt to fiery destruction. These are simplified images that are sometimes used to communicate a general idea, a shorthand. But each of these gods are far more complex and subtle than these single attributes, and in the case of Surt, this oversimplified image is used to malign and demonize. Some other oversimplified images like this might include Odin to war, Tyr to war, Freya to war, Thor to war. If you feel called upon to engage in reciprocity with Surt, personally I say go for it. Weigh the arguments for yourself and explore your spirituality accordingly. For me, Surt is a steward of the earth. Volcanoes deliver both wrath and gifts, and the same can be said for the deity closely tied to them. I see his rivalry with Freyr as one of balance, similar to my view of Thor and Jormungandr, or Tyr and Fenrir. Each of these rivalries provide perspectives on humanity, nature, order, disorder, destruction, creation. Thor, for example, represents all of these and more, as do the other deities that I mentioned, even if they represent them in a different way. Our gods are not one-dimensional. They are complex. They balance each other out. Sometimes they are at odds, sometimes they are aligned. These concepts are intertwined, and they each have their time and place to be called upon, and in a variety of ways. Sometimes the table needs to be flipped, and sometimes the right deity to call upon for that is Surt. So hail Surt, first son of Muspel, dark god of poetry, god of creation and destruction. May we better understand you in the future. I want to give a special thanks to my close friends Distressed Flesh and Wolf the Red for this video. Distress hunted down several resources that made this video work, and Wolf provided excellent feedback on portions of this video that truly made it stronger. Y'all's support has been invaluable, and I very much appreciate it. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. I have not accepted sponsorships on this channel so far, and I want y'all to know that it is because of the patrons that I am able to do that. Every single video on this channel is sponsored by y'all. And I should say that, you know, be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it and all that stuff, but I shall warn you that the subscribe button and the like button are now covered in lava, so you are forbidden to press them. I better not see any of y'all doing that. Be sure to ring the bell for more heathen content, and remember to find a way or make one. Damn, that was a long video. You might say that it was a dissertation. Ha 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 ha.